Okay, so let's talk about the texture part of this. I have the models that we made on the previous video here, right? And this is our decimated one, and this is our very detailed one. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to delete this one. We're going to work with the decimated one just for demo purposes here. I'm going to go to my original file here, and I'm going to grab my 3 spheres with the 3 different textures that we got. We have 4, but we're going to use these 3 here. It's going to copy them. Control C, going back into my model here, Control V. Now, as I copy them, I also have the textures inside this file. If I go to my textures here, Mars ground 1 or 2, 1, and 3, right? And I'm going to set up here very quickly a lighting scenario just so we can see the texture. Nothing too crazy. We just want to work with the texture. First, we want to have some sort of lighting so we can see the form, just like that. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up. I'm going to bring this down here. I'm going to open up my shader editor. We can see that this is 1 texture, 2, and 3 there. And I am just going to, there's multiple ways that I can do this, but the way I'm going to do this first is I'm going to just copy one of the textures here. Let's start with the number 1, Mars ground 1. I'm going to select both models. I'm going to have the sphere as my active object. I'm just going to go here, copy material to select it. And boom. There's my first texture. Now, you can see that the scale of this, we have to pay attention to the scale of the texture based on the scale of the model compared to a human, right? Because if let's say let's bring a human here. Just copy this into here, right? If I have a human this big, in 3D, this is the actual size of a human, right? Now these rocks seem fairly big, right? Now I think this still could work, right? But you want to pay attention to how big your textures are based on a human, so that way it looks correct in terms of the scale. Now I'm gonna keep this guy here. Now what I'm going to do, I don't want to edit my main texture, which is the same one that I have here. I want to create sort of like a new texture for all my terrain that I'm going to be using. And so I'm going to go to the texture on the terrain, and I'm going to click this button here, new material. I'm just going to name it terrain. So now this sphere has still the 1, and this one has a new one, right? Now here, I'm going to see that I have my setup, which is the same as the other one, just on a different material. So now I can edit this one without worrying about editing my original one. The first thing that I want to do is sort of fix the scale just a little bit. So I'm going to go into my mapping here, value, and you can play with how much you want of this or how less, right? But I just want to scale it just a little bit. Maybe something like that. Let's do 12 here, just to round it up. So now you can see that the little rocks are a little bit better in terms of the scale, right? I can deal with those a little bit better. But if I zoom out like this, right, you can see that the texture, even though it's a tileable texture, you can sort of see the repetitive sort of setup of the texture itself, especially with the little rocks, right? And so we're going to try to break that up just a little bit. And the way we're going to do that is by adding other similar textures, right? And we have 3. And so this is going to be, I'm going to press Shift A, frame. I'm going to move all these into my frame. So now you can see that this is 1 texture, right? And I am going to click on these spheres, and I'm going to grab the whole texture, just these nodes. I'm going to copy them, Control C, go to my terrain, Control V, paste. So that's my second texture. I'm going to go to the third sphere, do the same thing. And paste. And we can add some frames here if we want to keep it organized. It's always good, especially when you start adding a lot of nodes and all that. It's good to have something organized, especially if you're working with other artists. Right now, you don't see any change here because these are not attached to anything. And so I'm going to do a very quick, simple setup of nodes here before I start attaching them. I'm going to use a noise texture. I'm also going to use a ramp, like so. Now, if you have no Wrangler on, that's the plugin Atom, you can Control Shift and click the node to visualize it in here. So this is our second texture, right? So now you can see that this one is attached to our output, right? This one has a little bit bigger rocks. It's not that bad, right? Let's take a look at the other one. Control Shift and click. Now this one has, it's almost like a more grainy sort of texture, which I sort of like because, for example, on this one, I have all these rocks, in all these different angles and all that, which sometimes it looks a little bit weird, but we can bring some of the more grainy texture into those areas to make it look a little bit more realistic. And so I sort of have an idea of what sort of the effect of each individual texture is going to have, right? And so let's take a look at this one. This one looks fine. We can, of course, we can always go to the here and scale it if you want to. Go back to our third one. Maybe scale this one just a little bit. Just like that. And now we can start mixing them. So let's go to a first one, right? This is the first one that we did. And I'm going to either create, if you have no Wrangler on, you can just press Control Shift and right click drag from one material to another, and it will mix them into a mix shader, right? If you don't have no Wrangler on, you can just Shift A, mix shader, bring that in, and then attach them manually. But if you have it on, then Control Shift, right click and drag, and it will attach them. Now you can see in here that right now is 50-50. So we see 50% of one, 50% of the other. If I move this, you're gonna see more of the other, right? But we don't want this. We want to tell Blender how to do this. And so we're using a noise texture. So I'm gonna attach the factor into the ramp and the color into my factor here. And the reason why we have a ramp is to increase our contrast of our noise texture. So you can see that the closer I put these, the harder the line. So if I press Control Shift click here, so you can see the actual ramp, you're gonna see that from here is very, very gradient transition. The closer they are, the more contrast, the harder the transition, or the sharper the edge. And so that's sort of what I'm looking for. And let's Control Shift click here. So now you can see that I have a little bit of one texture, a little bit of the other, sort of like spread out. And you can always play with the scale of the noise. Depending on the effect that you want. And you can play with the detail. So we're gonna play with some of the numbers with the roughness here. You can always play with the position of these two here. So maybe more to the left, right? You can bring this one back. As I'm doing this, I'm always looking over here just to kind of see the results. But you can see now that even with just a Zoo, I broke up the, I'll show you the difference here. I broke up the repetitiveness of this texture, right? So if I click here, broke it up, which looks a lot better, right? And so now we're going to do the same thing, but with another texture. So I can even copy this or duplicate it. I'm going to bring this results into here and my new texture into here. Control Shift and click. And I have another layer of texture. And we can always, of course, come here. I'm going to make it slightly different than the other one. Right. And now that gives us a little bit of more variety. And so this is a great, very easy setup to do when you have these type of textures. And we can go even further, right? So we can even take this further. Let's move this back down. Let's say I'm using cycles here. This will only work in cycles, but we can even use, let's say, actually, let's go back to Eevee, just so we can see that. I'm gonna copy my last texture or duplicate it. That's the more grainy one. And instead of this setup with a noise, I'm just going to do a texture coordinate, separate X, Y, and Z, and wrap. I'm gonna use my normals for my X, Y, and Z, the Z axis, the one up and down. And now I'm gonna attach this to the factor. And my results of these, which is everything together, again here, Control Shift and click to see this. Now we're gonna play with our ramp here. Just gonna see what we're getting here. And I'm gonna Control Shift and click so you can see it. But you can see how I'm using that texture now in here. So probably maybe something like this. Right. So now I'm getting this sort of pockets of areas of texture here. I'm gonna control apply or transform here just in case, orient to geometry. And let's play with the ramp again. It's very visible, but you can see over here or in the normals that are facing up how I am adding that texture into it. Right. You can also use instead of normals to generate it. You can play with the different setups depending on, of course, depending on how much of the texture you want the type of effect that you want. Sort of bringing it down over here. But you can easily see how very easy you can do a quick setup like this and bring some variety to your terrain. And so a great thing about this now is that, yes, you spend that time for this one, right? But now, once you make 5, 10, 20 models like these, you can just apply the same texture to it and it will work the same. And so you only have to do this once. And that's a very, very easy way for you to have a lot of terrain material, of course, with the same texture, with just one setup like this.